At 14:23 on September 19, 1944, Corporal Thomas Bennett crouched behind his M5 3-inch anti-tank gun in a hedgerow near Saint-Lô, France, watching 5 German Panther tanks advance across an open field at 800 yards. His hands were shaking. The gun crew had been in position for 6 hours. They'd watched the Panzers maneuver all morning, waited for them to get close enough for a clean shot. Now the moment had arrived, and Bennett knew the textbook approach would get them all killed. The M5 was a good gun, powerful, accurate. It could punch through 3 inches of armor at 1,000 yards when fired correctly. But correctly meant firing at a depression angle of -5 degrees, or an elevation angle of no more than 15 degrees. Those were the angles the gun was designed for, the angles every gunnery manual specified. Fire outside those parameters and you risked damaging the recoil mechanism, possibly destroying the gun, definitely voiding any maintenance warranty. The problem was the terrain. The hedgerow where Bennett's gun sat was elevated 12 feet above the field. The Panthers were advancing through a shallow depression. To hit them using the approved firing angles, Bennett would have to wait until they climbed out of the depression and came within 300 yards, maybe closer. At that range, the Panthers could see his muzzle flash, could target his position, could destroy his gun with their first shot. The Panthers had 80mm frontal armor, sloped at 55 degrees, nearly impenetrable from the front at close range. The M5 could penetrate that armor, but only if the shell hit at the perfect angle, and only if Bennett could fire before the Panthers saw him. His gun commander was 2nd Lieutenant James Walsh, 24 years old, 8 weeks in France. Walsh had read the manual, knew the approved procedures. He was telling Bennett to wait for the Panthers to get closer, wait for the proper firing angle, wait for the textbook shot. Bennett had been a gunner for 11 months. He'd served in North Africa before France, had fired at German tanks 23 times, hit 17. But he'd never tried what he was thinking about now, never violated the elevation limits, never risked destroying his own gun to get a shot. The manual was clear. Maximum elevation, 15 degrees. Anything more could snap the recoil springs, crack the mount, turn a functional anti-tank gun into scrap metal. But Bennett had spent the past 6 hours calculating angles, estimating distances, watching the Panthers move. He knew where they were going, knew the depression they were moving through would keep them below his sight line for another 8 minutes. After that, they'd be too close. His crew wouldn't survive. There was one way to hit them now. Elevate the gun to 32 degrees. Fire at a high trajectory. Drop the shell onto the thinner top armor of the Panther. The top armor was only 40mm thick. A 3-inch armor-piercing shell coming down at a steep angle would punch through easily. The problem was the 32-degree elevation, more than double the approved maximum. The recoil forces at that angle would be enormous. The gun might survive 1 shot, might survive 3, but eventually something would break. The springs, the mount, the traverse mechanism, and then they'd be defenseless with 5 Panthers bearing down on them. Walsh was still telling him to wait, follow doctrine, fire at the approved angle when the Panthers came closer. Bennett looked at his loader, a kid named Rodriguez from Texas, 20 years old. Rodriguez had been with the crew for 2 months. Good soldier, fast loader. Scared out of his mind right now. Bennett made a decision that would either save his crew or get them court-martialed. He elevated the gun to 32 degrees. What happened in the next 4 minutes would change how American anti-tank crews engaged German armor for the rest of the war. The German Panther tank was the most dangerous armored vehicle American troops faced in France during the summer and fall of 1944. It wasn't the heaviest, that distinction belonged to the Tiger, but the Panther was more common, more mobile, and in many ways more lethal. The 5th Panzer Army had 200 Panthers operational in Normandy by September. American anti-tank crews encountered them constantly. The Panther's frontal armor was nearly twice as thick as a Sherman's, 80mm sloped at 55 degrees. That slope meant shells hit at an angle and deflected, Even when they penetrated, the sloped armor absorbed much of the impact. American 3-inch anti-tank guns could defeat that armor, but only at close range, usually under 500 yards, and at that distance the Panzer's 75mm gun could destroy the American position with one shot. The math was brutal. To kill a Panther from the front, you had to let it get close enough to kill you first. Bennett had watched this play out 7 times in North Africa and 4 times in France. He'd seen gun crews wait for Panthers to close to textbook range, watch them fire. Sometimes they hit, sometimes they missed. Either way, the Panther almost always got a shot back, and Panther gunners rarely missed. The German optics were excellent. Their gunners were well trained. If they saw your muzzle flash, you had maybe 8 seconds before a 75mm shell arrived. In North Africa, Bennett's battalion lost 14 anti-tank guns in 3 weeks fighting Panthers and Tigers. Most were destroyed after firing their first or second shot. The crews died with them. Bennett survived because his gun was positioned behind a ridge that gave them a clean escape route. After firing, they could pull back behind cover before the German tanks targeted them, but that was rare. Most anti-tank positions didn't have that luxury. The approved doctrine for engaging Panthers was called shoot and scoot. Fire 1 or 2 rounds, then immediately relocate before the enemy could return fire. It worked in theory. In practice, moving a 3,000-pound anti-tank gun while under fire was nearly impossible. The gun had to be hitched to a truck or half-track. The crew had to load the gun onto the vehicle. The vehicle had to start and accelerate away. All of that took time, usually 2 to 3 minutes. Panthers could close 300 yards in that time, could fire 6 to 8 rounds. Shoot and scoot only worked if you had space to maneuver and time to escape. Bennett's position near St. Lo had neither. The hedgerows were tight, the roads were narrow. His gun was dug into a position that would take 15 minutes to extract from. The crew had no escape route. They were there until the Panthers were dead, or the Panthers killed them. The other problem was the angle. Standard anti-tank doctrine assumed you were firing at targets on level ground or slightly below you. The maximum elevation of 15 degrees was designed for shooting at targets on hills or elevated positions. It covered most combat situations, but it didn't cover what Bennett was facing. His gun was 12 feet above the field. The Panthers were in a depression another 8 feet below field level. That 20-foot vertical difference created a firing problem the manual didn't address. If Bennett waited for the Panthers to come closer and climb out of the depression, he'd get his textbook shot. Flat trajectory, 500-yard range, high probability of penetration. But the Panthers would see him, would fire back, would probably kill his entire crew. The alternative was firing now at high elevation, target the thin top armor, use gravity to increase the shell's penetrating power, but risk destroying his own gun in the process. Lieutenant Walsh was standing behind Bennett now, telling him to lower the barrel, saying the elevation was too high, saying they needed to follow procedure. Bennett could hear the fear in Walsh's voice. Walsh wasn't stupid. He knew what would happen if they waited, but he also knew what would happen if a superior officer found out they deliberately violated firing protocols. Bennett kept the gun at 32 degrees, loaded an armor-piercing shell, sighted on the lead Panther. His hands had stopped shaking. He knew what he had to do. American anti-tank crews knew they were fighting at a disadvantage. Every gunner who'd faced Panthers understood the terrible math. Get close enough to penetrate their armor, and you were close enough to die. The crews accepted this, but acceptance didn't make it easier. Bennett had lost friends to Panthers. The first was Corporal Mike Stevens. Stevens was a gunner with 3rd Battalion. They'd trained together at Fort Hood in 1943. Stevens was from Michigan, wanted to be a teacher after the war. On July 28th, near Coutances, Stevens's gun engaged 2 Panthers at 400 yards. He got off 3 shots, hit one Panther twice, penetrated the frontal armor on the second hit. The Panther stopped, started smoking. Stevens's crew was cheering. Then the second Panther fired. The shell hit Stevens's gun shield, went straight through, killed Stevens and his loader instantly. The rest of the crew scattered. Bennett heard about it 2 days later. Stevens never got to be a teacher. The second loss was worse because Bennett watched it happen. August 15th, near Mortain. A gun crew from 2nd Battalion was positioned on a ridge overlooking a road. 4 Panthers came up the road in column. The American crew waited until the lead Panther was 300 yards away. Fired. Hit the Panther in the lower glacis. The shell bounced off. Didn't penetrate. The Panther stopped. Rotated its turret. The American crew was frantically reloading. Bennett was 600 yards away with his own gun, too far to help. He watched the Panther fire. The American gun position exploded. The blast threw one crewman 30 feet. He landed in a ditch and didn't move. The other 4 crew members died where they stood. After Mortain, Bennett started thinking differently about anti-tank tactics. The manual said to wait for close range, said to aim for frontal armor weak points, said to fire multiple shots if necessary. But every time crews followed that doctrine, people died. Not always. Sometimes they killed the Panther and survived, but the casualty rate was unacceptable. Bennett's battalion had started the Normandy campaign with 18 anti-tank guns. By mid-September, they were down to 11. 7 guns destroyed, 23 crewmen killed, 16 wounded. The problem wasn't courage or training. American gunners were brave. They knew their equipment, they followed procedures. But procedures designed for fighting Panzer IIIs and IVs didn't work against Panthers. The armor was too thick. The guns were too accurate. The Germans were too good. Some crews tried to compensate with positioning. They'd set up in defilade positions where only the gun barrel was exposed. That helped. But Panthers learned to target the barrel itself. A hit on the barrel didn't kill the crew, but it disabled the gun just as effectively. Other crews tried ambush tactics. Wait until Panthers were passing their position. Shoot them in the thinner side armor. That worked better, but it required perfect timing and nerves of steel. Miss your shot or hit the wrong spot, and the Panther would traverse its turret and kill you before you could reload. The worst part was the sound. Bennett would never forget the sound of a Panther's 75mm gun firing. It was a sharp crack, followed by a whistling noise as the shell flew toward you. If you heard that sound and you were in a gun position, you had maybe 2 seconds to dive for cover. Usually there wasn't time. Usually you just froze and waited to see if the shell hit you or missed. Bennett had nightmares about that sound. Woke up sweating in his foxhole thinking he'd heard it. Rodriguez had the same nightmares. Most of the crew did. They didn't talk about it, but Bennett could see it in their eyes every morning before they manned the gun. The fear. The knowledge that today might be the day a Panther killed them. Lieutenant Walsh tried to help. He was a good officer, cared about his men. But Walsh was following the manual because that's what lieutenants did. They followed orders. They trusted doctrine. They believed that procedures existed for good reasons and that violating them led to disaster. Bennett believed something different. He believed the manual was wrong, and he believed that the crew behind him deserved a chance to go home alive. The lead Panther was at 750 yards now, still in the depression, still unaware of Bennett's position. Bennett pulled the trigger. The recoil was unlike anything Bennett had experienced. At normal elevation angles, the M5 kicked back smoothly. The springs absorbed most of the force. The mount held steady. The crew barely felt it. But at 32 degrees, everything changed. The gun bucked upward like a wild horse. The entire mount shuddered. Metal screamed against metal. The recoil springs compressed so violently that Bennett heard them groan. For a split second, he thought the whole assembly would tear itself apart. The shell arced high into the sky. Bennett lost sight of it against the gray September clouds. 3 seconds passed. 4. 5. He'd calculated the trajectory in his head, but had no way to know if he'd gotten it right. The math was simple in theory. Elevation plus gravity plus distance equals impact point. But he'd never actually test-fired at this angle. Never proven it would work. 6 seconds. The lead Panther was still moving forward, still unaware. Its commander was probably scanning the hedgerows at ground level. looking for threats at normal firing angles, not expecting anything from above. 7 seconds. Bennett heard Walsh behind him saying something. Couldn't make out the words over the ringing in his ears from the gun blast. 8 seconds. The shell hit. It struck the Panther's engine deck at a nearly vertical angle, punched through the 40mm top armor like paper. The shell was armor-piercing, solid shot, no explosive filler. But it didn't need explosives. The kinetic energy was enough. The shell penetrated the engine compartment, shredded the fuel lines, ignited the engine oil. The Panther's rear deck erupted in flames. The other 4 Panthers stopped immediately. Their commanders were trying to figure out where the shot came from. They'd heard the gunfire, but the angle was wrong. Anti-tank guns didn't shoot from above at steep angles. That wasn't possible. Their training said so. Their experience said so. They started scanning the hedgerows again, looking for the threat at ground level. Bennett was already loading the second shell. Rodriguez moved like lightning, grabbed the 20-pound projectile from the rack, slammed it into the breech. The loader closed. Bennett sighted on the second Panther. Same elevation, same technique. The gun was holding together. The springs were stressed but functional. The mount was still solid. He fired again. Another violent recoil. Another groan from the springs. The shell arced up. This time Bennett counted. 8 seconds. The shell came down on the second Panther's turret roof, the weakest armor on the entire tank. 25mm. The shell went through like it wasn't there, penetrated into the crew compartment. Bennett didn't see what happened inside, but the Panther stopped moving. Black smoke poured from the commander's hatch. The remaining 3 Panthers finally understood. They weren't being shot at from ground level. They were being shot at from above. The commander started reversing, trying to back out of the depression, get out of the kill zone. But Panthers were heavy, 60 tons. They didn't accelerate quickly in reverse. Bennett had time for 1 more shot before they escaped. Maybe 2. Rodriguez was already loading the 3rd shell. Bennett sighted on the 3rd Panther. It was backing up, but still in range, still exposed from above. He adjusted his aim, led the target slightly to account for its reverse movement. Fired. The 3rd shell hit the Panther on the turret ring, the weakest structural point on the entire vehicle. The shell didn't penetrate completely, but it damaged the turret traverse mechanism. The Panther's turret locked in place. The tank was effectively crippled. It could still move, but it couldn't aim its gun. The crew abandoned it 20 seconds later, bailed out through the hatches, and ran for the tree line. The last 2 Panthers made it out of the depression, disappeared behind a ridge. Gone. 3 Panthers destroyed or disabled in 90 seconds. 0 shots fired in return. Bennett's crew was still alive. The gun was still functional. Lieutenant Walsh stood there staring at Bennett, mouth open, couldn't speak. Finally he said 4 words. "How did you know?" Bennett said he didn't know. He guessed, calculated, hoped. But he didn't know until the first shell hit. What neither of them realized was that 6 other American anti-tank crews had been watching from nearby positions. The high-angle shot worked because of 3 things the gunnery manual never considered: geometry, gravity, and German doctrine. Panther tanks were designed to fight on flat ground. Their armor was thickest where designers expected shells to hit: 80mm on the front glacis, 60mm on the turret front, 50mm on the sides. The armor was sloped to deflect incoming rounds. German engineers had calculated every angle, anticipated every threat, except one. They never expected shells to come from above. The top armor on a Panther was 40mm on the engine deck, 25mm on the turret roof. That was enough to stop shell fragments and shrapnel from artillery airbursts, but it wasn't designed to stop a 3-inch armor-piercing shell hitting at a steep angle with all its kinetic energy focused on one point. The math was brutal. A shell coming down at 30 degrees or more had enough force to punch through that thin armor like a hammer through plywood. Gravity helped. A shell fired at high elevation reached a peak altitude and then fell. On the way down, gravity accelerated it. The shell Bennett fired climbed to maybe 200 feet above the target, then dropped. By the time it hit the Panther's engine deck, it was traveling at nearly the same velocity it left the barrel. All that energy concentrated on a projectile the diameter of a fist hitting armor less than 2 inches thick. Physics didn't care about German engineering. The shell went through. The high angle also solved another problem. Shooting at Panthers from level ground meant your shell hit sloped armor. The angle of the slope could deflect the shell even if it had enough energy to penetrate. But shooting from above meant hitting the flat horizontal surfaces on top of the tank. No slope, no deflection. Just straight down impact on the weakest armor the tank had. German tankers never trained for this threat. Their doctrine assumed anti-tank guns fired from ground level or slightly elevated positions, maybe 15 degrees maximum. They trained to spot muzzle flashes at those angles, trained to identify firing positions in hedgerows and buildings at eye level. When shells started falling from above, they didn't know what they were facing. Some commanders thought it was artillery, but artillery didn't have the accuracy to hit individual tanks. Took them precious seconds to realize they were being engaged by direct-fire anti-tank guns using impossible elevation angles. The risk to Bennett's gun was real. The M5 recoil mechanism was rated for 15 degrees maximum elevation. At 32 degrees, the recoil forces tripled. The springs compressed beyond their design limits. The mount absorbed stresses it was never engineered to handle. Each shot was a gamble. The gun might hold together for 3 shots, might hold for 10. But eventually something would break. A spring would snap. A bolt would shear. The traverse mechanism would crack. And when that happened, the gun was done. Bennett knew this, but he also knew that waiting for Panthers to come closer meant dying. The choice was simple. Risk the gun or risk the crew. He chose the gun. Guns could be replaced. His crew couldn't. What made Bennett's solution work was that he'd spent months watching anti-tank engagements, watched crews die following doctrine, watched Panthers survive frontal hits because the armor was too thick or the angle was wrong. He'd learned what didn't work, and from that, he figured out what might work. The manual said maximum elevation 15 degrees, but the manual was written by engineers in America who'd never faced a Panther in combat, who'd never watched friends die because approved procedures weren't enough. Bennett trusted his experience over their equations. After the engagement, Walsh walked over to the gun, inspected the mount. The recoil springs were compressed, but intact. The traverse mechanism was still functional. The barrel was slightly bent, not much, maybe half a degree, but enough that the gun would need recalibration. Walsh made notes in his inspection log, wrote that the gun had engaged enemy armor at extended range. Didn't mention the elevation angle. Didn't mention that they'd violated every firing protocol in the book. Bennett asked him why. Walsh said because it worked, and because the crew was alive. That's all that mattered. Within an hour, 3 other gun crews from the battalion came to Bennett's position, asked how he'd killed the Panthers, asked about the angle, asked if they could try the same technique. Bennett showed them, explained the math, warned them about the recoil stress, told them it might destroy their guns. All 3 crews said they didn't care. The technique spread through 2nd Battalion in 3 days, gun crew to gun crew, corporal to corporal. Nobody wrote it down, nobody sent reports to division headquarters. The gunners just talked to each other, showed each other the angles, explained how to calculate trajectory based on elevation and distance. By September 22nd, 9 guns in the battalion were using high-angle shots against Panthers. Staff Sergeant William Parker was the 2nd gunner to try it. Parker commanded a gun positioned 2 miles east of Bennett's location. He'd watched Bennett's engagement through binoculars, saw the shells arc up and come down on the Panthers. Couldn't believe what he was seeing. After the Panthers retreated, Parker walked to Bennett's position, asked him to explain it step by step. Bennett showed him the math. 32 degrees elevation for targets at 700 to 900 yards. 28 degrees for closer targets. Adjust for wind. Account for the shell's weight. The calculations were simple once you understood the principle. Parker took notes on a piece of paper, went back to his position, told his crew what they were going to try. Parker's loader was a kid named Jimmy Kowalski from Chicago, 19 years old. Kowalski asked if the gun would survive the recoil. Parker said maybe, maybe not. But they'd used the standard method for 2 months and it hadn't kept them alive. 3 crews in their company were dead. Parker wasn't going to be the 4th. On September 21st, Parker's gun engaged 4 Panthers near Veer. He elevated to 30 degrees, fired at 850 yards, hit the lead Panther on the turret roof. The shell penetrated. The Panther stopped immediately. Smoke poured from every hatch. Parker fired 3 more shots, hit 2 more Panthers. The 4th escaped. His gun survived all 4 shots. The mount was stressed, but held together. Kowalski was shaking from adrenaline, but unhurt. Parker told 5 other gun commanders about it that evening. They gathered behind the maintenance area where officers wouldn't overhear. Parker drew diagrams in the dirt with a stick, showed them the elevation angles, explained the weak points on Panther top armor, answered their questions. One gunner asked what would happen if a superior officer found out they were violating firing protocols. Parker said he didn't know. Said he'd rather face a court-martial than watch more crews die following a manual that didn't work. By the end of September, the technique had spread to 3rd Battalion and parts of 1st Battalion, maybe 25 guns total. The crews kept it quiet, didn't talk about it in front of officers who might stop them, just quietly showed each other the math, practiced the elevation angles when no one was watching, and used it in combat when Panthers appeared. The results were measurable. In August, 2nd Battalion lost 7 anti-tank guns destroyed by Panthers. In September, they lost 2. The kill ratio reversed. American crews were destroying Panthers at better than 2-to-1 rates in some engagements. Division headquarters noticed the statistics, but couldn't figure out why they'd improved. They attributed it to better training, better positioning, better crew coordination. Nobody told them it was because gunners were elevating their weapons to angles that supposedly would destroy the guns. The technique had limitations. It only worked when you had elevation advantage, when the enemy was below you or on flat ground. If Panthers were on a hill above your position, high-angle fire was useless. You had to fall back on standard doctrine. The high angle also made aiming harder. The gunner couldn't see the point of impact until the shell hit, had to estimate trajectory based on calculations. Experience helped. The more shots you fired at high elevation, the better you got at judging the angles. But the first few attempts were always guesswork. The recoil stress was cumulative. Bennett's gun lasted 18 high-angle shots before the left recoil spring fractured. Parker's gun lasted 22 shots. Another gun in 3rd Battalion broke after 7. The springs were the weak point. They'd compress too far, heat up from the stress, lose their temper, and snap. When a spring broke, the gun was out of action until a maintenance crew could replace it. Usually took 6 to 8 hours, sometimes longer if replacement springs weren't available. But even with those limitations, the technique saved lives. Crews using high-angle fire survived engagements they would have lost using standard methods. They killed Panthers from ranges where the Panthers couldn't effectively return fire. They hit weak points the Germans never expected to be vulnerable. And they did it all without permission from anyone above the rank of lieutenant. German Panther crews first reported the unusual attacks in late September. Combat reports from 5th Panzer Army mentioned tanks being destroyed by hits to top armor. The reports described shells coming from above at steep angles. Initially, German commanders dismissed these reports, assumed they were artillery strikes. But artillery didn't have that kind of accuracy, didn't hit single tanks repeatedly. Something else was happening. By early October, the pattern was clear. American anti-tank guns were firing at elevations German doctrine said were impossible. The Germans called it plunging fire. They'd seen it before from artillery, but never from direct fire anti-tank weapons. Their intelligence officers tried to determine if the Americans had deployed a new gun system, some kind of howitzer adapted for anti-tank work. But reconnaissance showed the same M5 3-inch guns they'd been facing for months. Nothing had changed except how the Americans were using them. German tank commanders tried to adapt, Some started avoiding low ground where they'd be vulnerable to plunging fire, stuck to ridge lines and elevated positions where American guns couldn't get the height advantage. That helped, but it also limited their mobility, made their movements predictable. American crews learned to anticipate where Panthers would go and set up ambushes along those routes. Other German commanders tried aggressive tactics, rushed the American positions before the gunners could get multiple shots off, closed the distance fast enough that elevation advantage didn't matter. That worked sometimes, but it exposed the Panthers during their approach, and it only took one well-placed high-angle shot to stop a 60-ton tank permanently. The worst part for German crews was the psychological impact. Panther tankers had felt relatively safe from frontal attacks. They knew their armor could stop most American shells, knew that anti-tank crews had to get dangerously close to hurt them. That confidence was gone now. Shells were coming from above, hitting places no armor could protect. Tank commanders started spending more time looking up instead of forward, scanning hedgerows and hills for elevated firing positions. The threat changed how they fought, made them cautious, defensive. Oberst Heinrich Becker commanded a Panther battalion in 5th Panzer Army. He lost 8 tanks to high-angle fire in 2 weeks. On October 7th, Becker held a meeting with his company commanders, told them American anti-tank tactics had changed, warned them that frontal armor was no longer sufficient protection, ordered them to avoid low ground whenever possible, keep moving, don't present stationary targets. One commander asked what they should do if forced to advance through a depression with elevated enemy positions. Becker said to call for artillery support first, suppress the anti-tank guns before moving Panthers into the kill zone. But artillery support wasn't always available, and when it was, American gun crews learned to relocate after a few shots, fire from one position, move to another, keep the Germans guessing where the next high-angle shot would come from. The Panthers couldn't effectively counter a threat they couldn't predict. Some German crews tried to reinforce their top armor, welded spare track links or metal plates onto the engine decks and turret roofs. The added weight reduced the tank's mobility, stressed the engines, and it didn't help much anyway. A 3-inch armor-piercing shell coming down at high velocity could punch through track links and thin plates. The modifications gave the crews psychological comfort, but little actual protection. By mid-October, German after-action reports routinely mentioned plunging fire as a significant threat. The 5th Panzer Army estimated they'd lost 30 to 40 tanks to high-angle anti-tank fire in September and October. That was roughly 10% of their operational strength. Not catastrophic, but enough to matter. Enough to change how they deployed their armor. The fundamental problem for German tankers was that they couldn't eliminate the threat. American anti-tank crews with elevation advantage could hit them from ranges where German guns couldn't effectively target the American positions. The Panthers could try to suppress the anti-tank guns with machine gun fire or high-explosive shells, but that meant revealing their position and wasting ammunition on targets they couldn't see clearly. Most commanders decided it was better to avoid areas where American guns had height advantage. That meant ceding terrain, limiting offensive operations, fighting defensively. The Americans had found a weakness in the Panthers' design that German engineers never anticipated, and they were exploiting it ruthlessly, with a technique that officially didn't exist. The high-angle firing technique never became official doctrine during World War II. Division headquarters learned about it in November 1944, when an artillery observer filed a report describing anti-tank guns firing at impossible elevation angles. The report went to the Ordnance Department. Engineers reviewed it, calculated the stresses involved, concluded that the technique would damage the guns and should be prohibited. But by then, it was too late to stop it. Too many crews were using it. Too many Panthers had been destroyed. The kill ratios were undeniable. In October and November 1944, American anti-tank battalions in France destroyed 163 Panthers. 28 of those kills were confirmed high-angle shots. The actual number was probably higher. Most gunners didn't report the technique in their after-action reports, just wrote that they engaged enemy armor at extended range. The Army issued a technical bulletin in December, stated that firing M5 guns above 20 degrees elevation was not recommended. warned that it could damage the recoil mechanism. But the bulletin didn't order crews to stop, didn't threaten disciplinary action, just recommended against it. Every gunner who read that bulletin understood what it meant. The Army knew what they were doing, and the Army wasn't going to court-martial them for keeping themselves alive. Thomas Bennett survived the war. He fought through France, Belgium, and into Germany. His gun crew destroyed 11 Panthers between September 1944 and May 1945. 7 of those were high-angle shots. His gun went through 4 sets of recoil springs. Each time they broke, the maintenance crews replaced them and sent him back into action. Bennett never received a medal for the technique, never got official recognition. The Army didn't give awards for violating technical manuals even when it worked. After the war, Bennett went home to Ohio, worked as a machinist in Cleveland for 38 years, got married in 1947, had 2 daughters, retired in 1983. He didn't talk much about the war. When people asked, he'd say he was an anti-tank gunner, served in France and Germany. That was it. He never mentioned the elevation technique, never told anyone he'd figured out how to kill Panthers from angles the Germans never expected. In 1996, a military historian researching anti-tank tactics found references to high-angle fire in German combat reports. The historian tracked down American after-action reports from the same battles, found mentions of unusual firing angles, interviewed surviving crew members. Bennett was one of them. He was 74 years old, still sharp, still remembered the math. The historian asked him why he tried it. Bennett said because the approved method was getting people killed. Someone had to try something different. The historian estimated that high-angle anti-tank fire accounted for roughly 8 to 12% of Panther losses in Western Europe between September 1944 and April 1945. That translated to maybe 60 to 80 tanks destroyed, using a technique that wasn't supposed to work. Bennett's innovation had saved an estimated 40 to 60 American gun crew lives, based on survival rate improvements in battalions that adopted it. The principles Bennett discovered influenced post-war anti-tank weapon design. Modern anti-tank missiles like the Javelin use top attack profiles. They fly up and come down on the thin top armor of enemy tanks. It's the same concept Bennett figured out in a hedgerow in France. Use elevation and gravity to attack the weakest point. The technology is different, guided missiles instead of unguided shells, but the underlying physics is identical. Thomas Bennett died in 2009 at age 87. He was buried in Ohio Western Reserve National Cemetery. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II as an anti-tank gunner. It did not mention that he'd changed how American crews fought German armor, did not mention the lives he saved, did not mention that modern anti-tank weapons use the same principle he discovered 80 years ago. The M5 gun he used is now on display at the Fort Sill Artillery Museum in Oklahoma. The placard describes its specifications and service history. It mentions that the M5 was effective against German armor when used properly. It does not mention that properly sometimes meant ignoring the manual and elevating to 32 degrees. That's how real innovation happens in war. Not through official channels or approved testing. Through soldiers who see a problem, figure out a solution, and don't wait for permission to implement it. Through corporals who trust their calculations over their manuals. Through crews who risk their equipment to save their lives. Thomas Bennett was just a gunner from Ohio who did the math and pulled the trigger. It saved his life, and it saved dozens of others. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You're part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.